Friedrich Nietzsche, one of the most influential, provocative, and misunderstood philosophers in history, had ideas that shook the very foundation of morality, religion, and culture. But among his most controversial statements are his remarks about women. Were they hateful, satirical, ironic, or something much deeper that we've all failed to understand? You've probably heard the infamous quote, "Are you going to women? Do not forget the whip," used endlessly to paint Nietzsche as a misogynist. But what if that's only scratching the surface? What if Nietzsche was exposing uncomfortable truths? Not just about women, but about how society views them, how gender roles are constructed, and how power works beneath the surface of relationships. In this video, we're diving into what Nietzsche actually said, why he said it, and how modern audiences have either misread or deliberately ignored his deeper message. You might find his views offensive or enlightening, but one thing is certain: Nietzsche didn't write to be liked. He wrote to force you to think. Let's peel back the layers of outrage, misinterpretation, and cultural bias, and uncover the truth about Nietzsche's vision of women, power, and the lies society tells itself. Before we dive into Nietzsche's remarks on women, we need to strip away the noise and meet the man behind the madness. Friedrich Nietzsche was not your typical philosopher. Born in 1844 in a small German village, he was the son of a Lutheran pastor and raised in a devoutly Christian household. But by his early 20s, Nietzsche had already begun to reject the very foundation of his upbringing. His later works are searing critiques of religion, morality, and societal norms, culminating in his infamous declaration, "God is dead." But Nietzsche's rebellion wasn't just ideological, it was existential. He suffered from debilitating migraines, blindness, and physical ailments that left him isolated and withdrawn from public life. He never married, never had children, and eventually fell into complete mental collapse by the age of 44. He would spend the final decade of his life in silence, cared for by his mother and sister. Yet it was during this chaotic period that Nietzsche wrote his most powerful works. Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Beyond Good and Evil, The Gay Science, The Antichrist. These weren't just philosophical texts. They were firebombs hurled at the heart of 19th century European values. And Nietzsche didn't want disciples. He wanted destroyers, people willing to unlearn what they'd been told and confront the abyss of their own assumptions. So when Nietzsche writes about women, or anything for that matter, we must ask, is this an instruction, a metaphor, a provocation, or all three? We also can't ignore the fact that Nietzsche had a very complicated personal relationship with women. He fell in love with Lou Andreas Salome, a brilliant and independent intellectual who rejected his proposal and likely broke his heart. This experience deeply shaped his view of romantic idealism, power dynamics, and the illusions that men often project onto women. So is Nietzsche speaking from bitterness? Possibly, but also from brutal honesty about the games we play, the lies we tell, and the truths we don't want to hear. His writing isn't always fair, it's not always kind, but it's never simple. And that's exactly why it still matters. Now let's look at what Nietzsche actually said about women and how it's been wildly misinterpreted. Let's revisit the infamous quote from Thus Spoke Zarathustra. "Are you going to women? Do not forget the whip." It's harsh, it's jarring, and for many, it feels like a line that disqualifies Nietzsche from any serious conversation about gender. But here's the twist. This line is spoken by a character, an old woman, not Nietzsche himself. In the book Zarathustra, Nietzsche's prophetic mouthpiece approaches an elderly woman, and she offers him this strange piece of advice. Nietzsche isn't saying this directly. He's constructing a scene, and like all literature, it requires interpretation. And here's where many critics go wrong. Nietzsche was a philosopher who despised moralizing. He believed the world wasn't divided into good and evil, but into power and weakness, appearance and truth. He often used extreme imagery to tear through social pretense. So when he writes something shocking, the goal isn't to endorse, it's to provoke. In Beyond Good and Evil, he writes, "Woman wants to be independent, and therefore she begins to enlighten men about woman as such. This is one of the worst developments of the general uglification of Europe." Again, on the surface it sounds degrading. But here, Nietzsche is reacting not to women, but to modernity's attempts to redefine womanhood through rationalism, politics and ideology, something he also detested when done to men. He believed that turning everything, including gender, into an abstract intellectual category was a form of decay, what he called decadence. In another passage he says, "Woman's greatest art is the lie." Here he's drawing on classical philosophical ideas that see women as mysterious, instinct-driven, and emotionally manipulative. But even this, to Nietzsche, is not necessarily a condemnation. He saw instinct and deception not as flaws, but as tools of survival in a power-driven world. In many places, Nietzsche also praises the intuitive power of women. He admires their cunning, their connection to the body, and their rejection of the abstract moral systems he associates with weakness. So what's really going on here? Nietzsche is not saying women are inferior. He's saying that men and women play different games of power. And in a world where truth is often a mask for control, those who can manipulate appearances, those who can lie effectively, hold real power. This is deeply uncomfortable for modern audiences who are used to black and white moral narratives. But Nietzsche didn't believe in those. He believed that behind every virtue is a hidden will to dominate. So when he critiques women, he is often, at the same time, critiquing the men who idealize them, the systems that define them, and the false moralities that trap everyone in roles they didn't choose. His writing on women is difficult, often offensive, but intentionally so. Because Nietzsche didn't write for comfort, he wrote for confrontation. So now we face the central question. Was Nietzsche a misogynist, or was he using women as a metaphor for something much larger? This question isn't just academic, it goes to the heart of how we interpret provocative thinkers. On the surface, yes, Nietzsche's remarks about women often appear dismissive, crude, and aggressive. But let's pause and consider how Nietzsche wrote. Nietzsche wasn't a systematic philosopher. He didn't give you clear definitions or step-by-step logic. He wrote like a poet, a provocateur, a surgeon of the soul. He used exaggeration, contradiction, and satire to shock readers into waking up. His goal was never to comfort, it was to unsettle. In this light, many scholars argue that Nietzsche's attacks on women are not literal, but symbolic. Women in his writing often represent nature, instinct, seduction, illusion, everything that stands in contrast to rationality, structure, and the Apollonian order he critiques elsewhere. For example, in The Birth of Tragedy, Nietzsche divides the world into the Apollonian, order, reason, form, and the Dionysian, chaos, emotion, instinct. While he doesn't explicitly associate the Dionysian with women here, later in his work, he often draws similar contrasts. Woman as the force of nature that cannot be fully understood or contained. So when he writes things like, "Woman has so much reason, reasonableness, that she can afford even to be foolish," is he demeaning her? Or is he saying that reason itself is not the highest value, and that women, being closer to nature, instinct, and life force, have access to deeper truths? Nietzsche was also deeply critical of men's illusions about women, especially the romantic idealizations that place women on pedestals only to punish them for not living up to the fantasy. He believed this kind of idealization was not love, but a projection of male weakness, a moral weakness that demanded purity, obedience, and predictability from something inherently wild and chaotic. In this way, Nietzsche doesn't just critique women. He critiques the entire concept of gender as it's constructed by society, especially within the rigid repressive morality of the 19th century. Another layer. Nietzsche didn't just write about women. He influenced many powerful female thinkers. Lou Andreas Salome, the woman who rejected his marriage proposal, went on to become a philosopher and psychoanalyst in her own right, working closely with Freud and Rilke. She deeply admired Nietzsche, and even though they parted bitterly, she recognized the complexity of his thought and never reduced him to a sexist caricature. Later, feminist thinkers like Hélène Cixous, Luce Irigaray, and Judith Butler would engage with Nietzsche's ideas, not to condemn him but to wrestle with them, to find deeper insights into the nature of power, language, and identity. So was Nietzsche a misogynist? In a personal sense, perhaps. He was a man of his time, shaped by rejection, isolation, and a deep mistrust of intimacy. But in a philosophical sense, Nietzsche's writing on women was less about women themselves, and more about power, illusion, instinct, and truth, and how all of these play out in human relationships. He wasn't trying to define women. He was trying to tear down the lies that both men and women live under. Now here's the real tragedy. Nietzsche was trying to warn us, not just about gender roles, but about the entire structure of modern morality. And almost no one listened. Why? Because Nietzsche was dangerous. Not in a physical sense, but intellectually, psychologically. He asked questions that society didn't want to answer, and he exposed contradictions that still make us uncomfortable today. Take his critique of equality. Nietzsche didn't believe in the moral ideal of equality as inherently good. He saw it as a tool, a leveling mechanism used by the weak to suppress the strong. He believed that many modern ideas, including feminism as it was forming in his time, were rooted not in strength, but in resentment, what he called ressentiment. He thought this kind of moral rebellion, framed as justice or rights, often masked a deeper desire to punish, to control, to tear down anything that made one feel inferior. And this didn't apply just to women or gender, it applied to everyone. Nietzsche's point was this: morality itself had become a lie. It wasn't based on truth, it was based on fear. In this context, his remarks about women take on a new meaning. He wasn't just critiquing women. He was critiquing a society that lies to women, lies about women, and encourages them to lie to themselves in return. But why was he ignored? Or worse, why was he misquoted and distorted? Part of the reason lies in the medium. Nietzsche wrote in aphorisms, short, punchy statements that sound definitive, but are often riddled with irony. They're perfect for being ripped out of context. And that's exactly what happened. Add to that the fact that after his breakdown, Nietzsche's sister, Elisabeth Förster Nietzsche, took control of his estate. She was a nationalist and an anti-Semite who actively edited and manipulated his unpublished works to fit her agenda. She aligned his philosophy with proto-fascist ideology and helped build the myth of Nietzsche as a brutal, authoritarian thinker. This is how Nietzsche ended up being associated with Nazi ideology, despite being openly hostile to German nationalism, anti-Semitism, and mass conformity. The result? A century of misunderstanding. Nietzsche's radical critiques of power, morality, and identity were flattened into simplistic interpretations, many of them politically convenient, culturally sanitized, or just plain wrong. And when it came to his ideas on women, most people didn't want to go deeper. It was easier to dismiss him as a bitter, celibate misogynist than to confront the mirror he was holding up to society. But Nietzsche wasn't warning us about women. He was warning us about ourselves, our need for certainty, our fear of truth, our addiction to comforting lies. And now, more than ever, his warning deserves to be heard. So, after all the controversy, the metaphor, the madness, what can we actually take from Nietzsche's words about women in today's world? The answer might surprise you. In a time of extreme polarization, where identity politics dominate headlines and conversations around gender are either hyper-politicized or totally avoided, Nietzsche's work offers something rare, a confrontation with the uncomfortable complexity beneath the surface. He doesn't give us answers. He gives us the courage to ask better questions. One of Nietzsche's core insights is that people rarely say what they mean, or even know why they believe what they do. We inherit our values from culture, religion, media, education. And most of the time, we never stop to ask, where did this come from? What power structure does this serve? That's exactly what Nietzsche wanted us to do, to unmask the systems of belief that shape our identities, especially when it comes to gender. He saw that society traps women in impossible roles: the virgin, the seductress, the mother, the intellectual, the muse. And it traps men too, into being providers, warriors, rationalists, stoics. These roles are illusions, useful in some ways, but deadly when mistaken for truth. Nietzsche's critique of women was, at its core, a critique of how humans lie to themselves, how we shape each other through projection, fear, control, and need. And in relationships, romantic, political, or cultural, those dynamics can become games of power, masked as love or respect. So what can we do with this today? We can stop looking for simple narratives. We can resist the urge to cancel, sanitize, or deify thinkers because of one quote or one offensive line. We can read harder. We can embrace the contradictions. We can allow ourselves to feel discomfort without shutting down dialogue. We can recognize that Nietzsche, flawed and provocative as he was, gave us tools to see through the masks that society wears. And not just society, but the ones we wear ourselves. In the age of curated identities, performative virtue, and algorithm-driven outrage, Nietzsche's demand for authenticity feels almost revolutionary. He asked us to go beyond good and evil, to question whether what we call progress is actually progress, or just a new kind of control. And when it comes to gender, that message is powerful. Stop chasing ideals that were invented to keep you obedient. Stop living by moral codes you didn't choose. Stop defining yourself by someone else's story. Because in the end, Nietzsche wasn't writing about women or men. He was writing about freedom. Not freedom as comfort, not freedom as indulgence, but the terrifying, exhilarating freedom of creating your own values and having the strength to live by them. And that might be the most radical idea of all.